Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rails 94th New Social Environment. I am Nick, the Rails Curatorial Assistant, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation between Thelma Golden and Glenn Lowry. We are also thrilled to have the poet Anne Waldman here with us today, who will read a poem to close our program. And now I am very thrilled to hand the mic over to my Rail comrades, Helen Lee and Joachim Pissarro. So from here, I will pass it over to you, Helen and Joachim.
Thank you. Thank you, Nick.
Thanks so much, Nick. Welcome, everyone, and hello. Hello, Joachim. So good to see you. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Hope the same is true of you.
Yes. It's a wonderful privilege, and we've been looking forward to this opportunity to have Thelma and Glenn here with us. Let's just jump right in and start with an introduction. Joachim, do you want to begin?
Why not? Thank you, Helen. Thelma and Glenn, both of you, big hello and cheers, and so glad to be with you, even in this distant environment. And thank you to everyone at the Rail for organizing this. Thelma and Glenn, in fact, I had the chance, the luck, the privilege of interviewing you 5 and 3 years ago. Thelma, we'll begin with you, perhaps if you don't mind. You began your career very early on, straight out of your graduation at Smith College in 1987, I believe. You went straight into the Studio Museum, but soon you went to the Whitney Museum, where you stayed until 2000, and then had an extraordinary string of seminal exhibitions. I'm not only going to mention the Blackmail exhibition in '95, which many people still recall. In 2000, you returned to the Studio Museum as a deputy director, and then you became the director and chief curator in 2005. And from then on, it seems, Thelma, that your career as the helm, as the captain of this major institution, we will have other chances to discuss its significance, has been geared towards what is happening now. And it's interesting to correlate that with what's going on at MoMA, of course, but you have been spearheading this remarkable expansion project, which is currently underway, and which I'm sure you will want to tell us a little bit about. I'm not going to, it's impossible to give a list of all the landmark exhibitions you produced. Just for everybody's knowledge, 2018 was a landmark date in the city of New York, and more in the history of the museum, insofar as we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the creation of the Studio Museum, another very important date. So with this, without further ado, maybe Helen, you would like to introduce Glenn yourself?
I would. So Glenn, it's just an honor and privilege to be here with you in conversation. And I just wanted to remind everybody about your long and illustrious career at the helm of the MoMA since 1995. Since you've been at the helm, you've completed 2 major expansions. The one that was fully completed in 2006 was the monumental transformation designed by Yoshio Taniguchi, with a capital campaign of $850 million. And just last October, the MoMA reopened its most recent $450 million expansion project designed by Liz Diller with an additional 40,000 square feet. It encompassed a rehang of its entire collection, which includes over 200 works of art. Is that right, Glenn? And prompts a reconsideration of the story of modern and contemporary art, reinforcing the notion that a museum is always, in quotes, a work in progress. Hi, Thelma. Hi, Glenn. We're looking forward to catching up with you and seeing how you're doing.
Hello. It's wonderful to be here.
Thrilled to be with you.
So before we get too deeply engrossed in the conversation and all the wonderful and quite frankly positive projects and initiatives that you're both involved, both separately and together, Joachim and I were kind of wondering how you guys first met.
I honestly can't remember the first time we met, but I do remember being bowled over by meeting Thelma, having seen some of her exhibitions at the Whitney. and knowing all of the things that she had accomplished, it was for me a kind of thrill to discover that packed inside this incredible scholar was this equally animated human being who was just full of energy and ideas, but also capable of making these incredibly insightful exhibitions. And must have been sometime around 1995, 96, just after Black Male.
Well, thank you, Glenn. And I think the reason Glenn probably doesn't remember is because when I remember first meeting Glenn, we didn't actually meet. So I had the occasion to actually go to the Art Gallery of Ontario right as Glenn was transitioning. And it turned out that my trip there, Glenn happened to be in New York. So we didn't get to meet there in Toronto. It would have been somewhere in 94-ish, right around the time of his transition. But the second time we didn't meet, but I consider us meeting, was around 95, because Glenn, my very, very dear friend and longtime comrade, Marcus Samuelson, was the head chef and co-owner of Aquavit. And I used to go there often, and Glenn and his wife Susan and many others went there. And one evening, Marcus was the one who actually introduced us, not as fellow museum people in any way. I was a curator at the Whitney at the time. Glenn was the new director, but as just two of the many people who came to Aquavit. So that's actually how we first.
It was a great moment when Aquavit was still on 54th Street. I missed that restaurant enormously, even though Marcus has gone on to many great things.
That's right.
Place.
I was just going to say how important the food, and one of the things that I know we're all missing so much is the social aspect of being out in wonderful, lively settings like Aquavit and with Marcus Samuelson, who is such an important pioneer in what he does. So I know we're going to be eventually talking about how you guys work together for a long period of time, more than just in the past few years. It's been a culmination of many steps and a process that's taken some time. But I just wanted to actually ask you both a little bit about your individual institutions and how it may seem on the surface that the Studio Museum and the MoMA may not be very much alike, but in fact, they have some very similar ideas behind them in the way they were founded, in the way that the academic scholarship, the way that they expand historical perspectives, showing works of art that galvanize and polarize. Would you mind just giving a 20-second sort of look behind the scenes about why the MoMA and the Studio Museum can work so well together and sort of meet up in this moment today?
Who would you like to go first, Helen?
Well, Glenn, since you ask, I think it should be you.
Well, first of all, hello to everybody. It's great to be with you and to share a few moments with Thelma, talking about where we are today and how we collectively have gotten here. You know, the founding of the Museum of Modern Art really is about trying to show the most important, persuasive, interesting, and challenging art of our time. That was its mission in 1929, and it remains very much its mission today, although the art that we look at may be very different, may include different geographies, different perspectives, and a greater sensitivity to issues around gender, race, identity than at our inception. But the goal has always been to try to identify artists whose work makes an impact, to think hard about the relationship of that art to its immediate past, and to set it into its social, political, cultural, and artistic context. And in that way, I think we link naturally to a place like the Studio Museum, whose field of vision may be more defined, but whose commitment to those artists is equally intense. And so as we have evolved over time and have come to understand the limitations of one kind of art historical approach, which shaped the museum in the 80s and 90s, we've sought to find ways of extending, expanding, critiquing, and in a way enhancing our capacity to show the richness, complexity, and importance of art being made no matter where, but especially by artists of color here in the United States, as well as all sorts of new geographies like Africa and subcontinental India that had been previously absent or very close to absent in our practices.
Thelma, I think we have an image of a very early facade of the Studio Museum that shows both supporters of the MoMA and the Studio Museum. Can you tell us a little bit about that photograph, that image, and about that time, perhaps?
Yes, that image in front of 2033 Fifth Avenue, which was the Studio Museum's first home at 125th Street and Fifth Avenue, sort of represented the moment in our history when the museum took over that space. And our founding was a important and complex coming together of many different groups of people. Harlem residents, social activists, people from the African-American philanthropic and civic community, and members of the board, the junior council, and the staff of the Museum of Modern Art. And in this picture, some of that is represented, but it really forms our beginning. You know, the Studio Museum's founding was in one way an answer to, adding to the landscape of museums in New York, but it was also a challenge to that landscape, which at that point in 1968 did not in any way acknowledge the breadth and the depth of work made by African-American artists and artists of African descent. So the institution has always sort of positioned itself in complex ways, both in its founding moment, but over the 52 years that we've been in existence, as it relates to being definitive around creating a sense of what it means to reimagine and rethink museum in wider and broader definitions.
Mm-hmm.
So, Joachim, were you wanting to ask a question before we talk about?
Well, I'm thinking we discussed prior to, we had a small informal chat among the four of us, and we decided not to go too much into the history of each institution. And anyone at the RAIL is welcome to look at the number of links that will scan those very major significant institutions. Just as a matter of coincidence among the dates, I just briefly mentioned before introducing Thelma that the Studio Museum has just celebrated its half a century in 2018. MoMA is about to celebrate its 100th anniversary in 1929. My question would have been to both of you, each of you. You are at the helm, each of you, of an institution that is not another museum. In each case, MoMA in 29, the Studio Museum in 68 have been markers of a new type of museums that is not just another museum of contemporary art, another museum of modern art. There was the first in 1929. There was no museum such as the State Studio Museum in 68. I'm curious to maybe ask each of you how you see maybe the challenges and hopefully also the joys of running two institutions that have defined or redefined the museological world.
Well,
sorry.
I'll go. Yeah, I'll go first on that. I think it's a great privilege, but I want to say to your question, which is sort of beautifully formed around the uniqueness of our institutions, is that the Studio Museum, however, was in many ways, yes, creating something new and unique at that moment by creating a museum which cited itself in the present, right? So the Studio in our name came from the fact that from our founding moment, the museum had a residency program having living artists working in the museum. But in terms of the museum's historic commitment to the stewardship of objects and artworks by Black artists, it was being done in a tradition that already existed, particularly in the historically Black colleges and universities. So we weren't new in that regard. There were museums and galleries on the campuses of many of the HBCUs that had beautifully and rigorously stewarded right, this tradition. So we were looking at the ways in which I think at our founding that we both continued that tradition of cultural specificity, but also began to create in a museum an idea of a way in which we could exist as a challenge to the idea of what was the narrowness in the way that museums in that moment were engaging with the ideas of an expanded idea of art histories that included Black artists.
Mm-hmm.
I would say for us, it's an intriguing question about how do you take an institution that was created to be new and different, to represent artists and practices that were unfamiliar to an American public, that was international in perspective, and keep that fresh. So when Alfred Barr, our founding director, talked in 1939, a decade after our founding, but on the inauguration of our first home, custom built, he talked about the museum as a laboratory to which the public was invited, in which nothing was permanent. Over time, we became ever more staid, ever more permanent in our presence, and perhaps less laboratory-like in our willingness or ability even to be experimental. And so I think the challenge that the current cohort of curators and administrators and trustees have had is how do we return to the energy of our founding, recognizing that, of course, there's also 90 years of intervening history. And for me, the answer has been to see the museum as a work in progress, to actually recognize that unlike many other kinds of museums, we are not done and can never be done. And that our responsibility is actually to go back constantly and unpack, challenge, critique, and open up our past as much as it is to imagine new ideas, new positions, new artists, and new engagements. And this notion of the museum as a work in progress, to my mind, recognizes its transitory state, that just as you begin to imagine, oh, that's what the Museum of Modern Art is about, is the very moment we should be upending that and saying, no, actually, that's not really what we're about. We're also about something else. And the ability to constantly put forward, if you wish, hypotheses about how to think about modern art or contemporary art is a different condition than trying to theorize the problem as if it could be fully understood.
Great.
That's the pleasure for me.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you both. This is great. I might have another question,
So
Helen.
maybe this is.
Go ahead.
Maybe this is a good time to move forward to talk about some of the projects that you've been working on together. So I wanted to bring up the collaboration or the series of collaborations you've been working on since 2015. But before we do that, I wonder, Joachim, if you can give a little bit of background with Thelma and with Glenn about just a little bit of history about the work that others have done. I know there's so many who are friends of the rail. Aggie Gund comes to mind, and so many others in how some of these ideas, diversification of ideas have been taking place.
Well, I think as Thelma mentioned before, yes, the group of supporters of each and both institutions have always historically counted a number of great supporters in common. You just named Aggie, but luckily there are several major such supporters. What I'm interested, because I know that our audience and Thelma and Glenn both are eager to talk about the present moment. And what I'd like to turn to Thelma for a minute, because what I find very interesting, if I may, Thelma, in your approach of discussing the present situation we are, and you just did it with when I mentioned the creation of the Studio Museum, is that you're always rightly and very importantly insistent on the fact that there is substantial history, and the present moment itself is not just springing out of nothing. And that history itself is, I think, important to remember. I'm just going to mention one event, and I know that Thelma will happily augment, there's a mass of them, but I'm talking about an event at which I happened to be tangentially invited, I think 3 years ago, around 2017. Alice Walton invited me to dinner at her club, having had a whole day of meetings, of the conversations with both of you and other museum directors. This was done under the helm of the Walton Family Foundation and the Ford Foundation, and led to the creation of DAMLI, D-A-M-L-I, the Diversity Art Museum Leadership Initiative. And Thelma, you recently told me that, in fact, there is yet again, this is a very major initiative, but there is a whole history that goes back, you were telling me, to 1986 and perhaps even before. Do you want to expand a little bit on the, if I may say so, the history of the present that we're going through and how we're tackling this?
Yeah. Well, I think it's important to acknowledge that this sort of historic moment that we're in now is similar to the one in the late 60s that created the Studio Museum. Right? The museum founding was born out of a cultural conversation, but what was also a political conversation. Conversation happening in this country at that time around Black Power, and the way in which the Black arts movement and the larger sort of cultural conversation demanded almost that there be a museum in Harlem. Right? A Harlem that would imagine itself in a future was one that included art and artists and culture. And so much of not just the Studio Museum's founding in that moment, but also the founding of the Dance Theater of Harlem by Arthur Mitchell in the same year, and the National Black Theater by Barbara Ann Teer in the same year, were all part of a bigger project. And I feel in this moment, when we talk about the transformation that is being demanded of institutions, what I know, what I hope that we are going to see now is indeed those transformations in the institutions we have, but also the creation of institutions that we have yet to imagine, because that's what the Studio Museum is and was, and I hope continue to be an example of. But to your point specifically about the way in which the museum's commitment towards being also a voice to the necessity for equity in the institutional space for artists, for artworks, but also for arts professionals has been deeply, deeply important to the museum's life and is built into our structures. So my first job was as a fellow at the Studio Museum. That is what brought me into the museum world, which led to me getting a curatorial assistant position at the Whitney, and led to my more than decade-long career at the Whitney Museum before coming back to the Studio Museum. And programs like DAMLI and so many others, and particularly the fellowship program that Glenn and I have created together, are about this idea of creating more opportunity in this field for many.
Mm-hmm.
So perhaps this is a perfect segue to start talking about the partnerships, the Studio Museum in Harlem and MoMA's fellowship collaboration, which is an ongoing program that you began some time before, but has now partnered with MoMA. And it's recognizing both the diversity in trying to help diversify the museum profession and to strengthen the curatorial and training capacity around African and American diaspora, African American and African diaspora art. But before I start, I hope you don't mind me taking just a little moment to give a few statistics, a bit of data background on the Mellon's groundbreaking report from 2015. On art museums. These demographic statistics are based on a survey of the Association of Art Museum Directors, the members of that organization. And very simply, it shows that in 2015, 2% of curatorial positions were held by African Americans, and by 2018, there was it was increased to 4%, an increase of 21 positions. In another question or another statistic or perspective to look at it, in 2015, 84% of staff in intellectual leadership positions were white, while in 2018, 73 positions of intellectual leadership positions were white. So some improvement, but 20% of the people of color in museums held only 20% of people of color held intellectual leadership positions. And I just wanted to refer to an article by Kaywin Feldman in Apollo magazine entitled Museum Leadership in a Time of Crisis from May 2018. And she quotes the US Census Bureau estimating that by 2060, 57% of the US population will be people of color. And today, the majority of young people under 18 are people of color. So these demographics are actually, in a way, very encouraging, that there's the potential to expand the audience and that there is a possibility of diversifying all areas of museums, including staffing, programming, and collections. And I thought those little data points could be interesting when talking about not only the collaboration between the Studio Museum of Harlem and the MoMA, but also the larger landscape of what the cultural historical moment that we're in now, the significance of that.
You know, I might just jump in and say that the Mellon report, in a way, made obvious what many of us in the museum field knew. Perhaps not at some clear statistical level, but at an anecdotal level, that our field was overwhelmingly white, and that most of the major positions were in directorships and senior curatorial positions were not only white, but often held by men, even though the field is largely female. So there were all sorts of imbalances and inequities that were clear to anyone who looked at the field without having to go through the kind of quantitative analysis that the Mellon report did. And even then, that report relied largely on AAMD data, Association of Art Museum Directorship data. And the data itself skewed in the last couple of years as a different cohort of museums were invited to participate. But the bottom line is, you know, well over a decade ago, out of, you know, the kind of friendship that Thelma and I had developed, we began talking about what can we do about this? And, you know, at some point, you look at this and you say, well, this is not some theoretical or abstract problem, and it's sufficiently large that you're not going to be able to solve it with the stroke of a pen. And we started to say, well, why don't we just try and do something together? Why don't we just drill into this in a very direct way, perhaps not enormously impactful because of our capacity to deal with numbers, but why don't we just lock arms and figure out what we can do to add to the landscape by providing the training necessary to help people at the inception of their careers imagine that they could in fact have a job at the Studio Museum, at MoMA, or at any other museum. And the idea was, for me, what made the idea exciting wasn't that it was new and innovative, because there, as Thelma already pointed out, and as everyone in the field knows, there have been initiatives that have dealt with trying to develop opportunities for African-American men and women in the field. What made it interesting for me was that it could link these two very differently scaled institutions, a small institution and a large institution, an institution totally focused on its location in Harlem, and another institution focused on 53rd Street, and that all these different valences could come together and provide young people with an opportunity to see things across landscapes so that they could imagine all sorts of new and different opportunities. Plus, it gave Thelma and I the chance to work together even more closely than we had in the past. So that's why that's from my perspective, that was what made this so exciting.
And I think I agree with everything Glenn has said, and will add that, Helen, you beautifully sort of related some statistics. I'm grateful to everyone who's participating in the chat, but someone just put up another set of statistics that were equally important to this effort was the culture plan and the statistics that were created out of that by our former Commissioner of Cultural Affairs, Tom Finkelpearl, that looked at New York City, the 5 boroughs specifically. But in all cases, what it showed was a continuing way in which this field had not changed very much in a decade, and that was damning. And to Glenn's point, while clearly the issue requires systematic change, no one program is going to change it. There has been the incremental changes that have been created by the commitment on the part of individuals and institutions to engage deeply in this work. And it's really then the power that has come out of these shared efforts, ours, the efforts by Damley, the efforts by, through the Mellon Foundation Fellowships, and all of the ways in which individual institutions have committed, that we have seen some change. But here's where we are now. None of it represents the transformation necessary for this field to enter into its full potential in the 21st century.
Right.
And so what this also, for me, is about is our ability to begin to scale into just a different way in which we think about the systematic changes necessary to shift and change this field.
So perhaps this is a great time to look at some images. We are so happy that we have some examples of the work that the both of you have done to start partnerships with both young fellows and with artists in residence. Nick, is there an image that we can talk about that shows some of these shows and projects? So here we have an image of MoMA. Is that right?
Yep.
Perhaps we should go to the beginning.
Well, stay with that one. Stay with, because I think for me, that's like the perfect emblematic image of what's possible. I'll let Thelma speak to Michael's work, but all I'll say is that was the very first project in our new building that opened in October on our ground floor, free and accessible to anyone and everyone, at least pre-COVID. And to my mind, it couldn't have been a more celebratory way of announcing both the new museum and allowing an artist of incredible talent to have a real presence in New York. And it was brilliantly curated by
I've lost Glenn.
I think we did.
So Thelma,
So
tell us about.
So what I will say about this, I think it's important because, in this moment, as we talk about institutional change, one thing that I've been speaking about a lot as we talk about institutions and what we want and need and expect from them is that really that we're also talking about the ways in which we want to understand what equity looks like in the field. And for the Studio Museum, what that has meant is the thinking about our new building, not just as a bricks and mortar project, and I know we'll talk about that later, but what it means in our trajectory as an institution to get our first purpose-built building 52 years into our history. But in understanding what it was going to take for us to do that project, I was very grateful for the support of many colleagues in this city, but very particularly when I went to talk to Glenn about the ways in which what it was going to mean for the Studio Museum to close our building at 144 West 125th, to be without a space for a significant amount of time. It's when the idea for this partnership began to percolate. And so I think that it's important to also talk about the way in which institutional relationship can then result in what could be partnership, as opposed to partnership being the starting place. And so it was in that kind of conversation about how we would continue to serve and continue to do the work that we do that Glenn and his team offered this opportunity. And so this first project, Michael Armitage, a London-based Kenyan-born painter and artist who we had been deeply interested and engaged in, but our program, of course, stopped in January of 2018. And this project series exhibition allowed us to do what the Studio Museum's been doing for its whole history, which is to create for an artist an opportunity to present their work to a broad audience. And for us, this was an amazing way to stay engaged with our audiences and to meet new audiences as that exhibition was up at MoMA this fall.
Thelma, I think it's a really important point that you make, that it didn't start off as a partnership, but these are long-standing relationships that have been built over time in a landscape where there have been so many supporters and ideas surrounding these types of heralding or trying to support artists that may be slightly underrepresented in institutions. So it's not just a beginning point, but sort of a long journey, a result of a long journey that both institutions that you've been on, that artists like Michael Armitage have been on, that make this show so impactful. And do we have other images from both the fellowship program and or the artist in residence program and some of the work that they've done, the artists in residence that we can see?
Yeah, in addition to Michael's exhibition, which was his first museum exhibition in New York, we also have been thrilled to be in partnership at MoMA PS1, and last year presented our Artists in Residence exhibition there. And that was also amazing because MoMA PS1 and the Studio Museum also have a long history. Alana Heiss, the founder of PS1, was close to the three former directors of the Studio Museum, Mary Schmidt-Campbell, Kinshasa Conwell, and Lowry Sims. So there always had been this tie between the Studio Museum in Harlem and Alana's PS1 in Long Island City, and I continued that through Klaus's leadership, and then, of course, with Kate Fowle. So the opportunity now to have the Artist in Residence show happen there, it felt very much as if we've always had a similar kind of program as it's related to emerging artists. And so in many ways, this exhibition kind of lived among the program there in a kind of synergy that I think we all benefited from. This is Shabalaba Self's paintings. Our last presentation of the exhibition existed with each artist having a beautiful small room and then one shared room together. And we're looking forward to, once we sort of understand what the future looks like for all of our institutions, of continuing this partnership at MoMA PS1 for the subsequent classes of Artists in Residence while we are not in the building. This program is sort of bedrock to the Studio Museum, and really important for us that we continue it while we are closed.
Glenn, are there comments about how successful these shows have been, in your view, for the programming in general, and maybe more importantly, the larger museum landscape at large, both internationally and across the U.S.?
Can you hear me now? Good. So I certainly think they've been extremely successful at a very pragmatic level. They've allowed both of our teams to work well together, but they've also given a group of artists an opportunity to be seen who might not otherwise have been seen during the Studio Museum's closure, and to be seen perhaps by a different audience than they might have been seen by in the first instance. And certainly Michael's show was a huge success, critically, as well as in terms of our public that just found the work absolutely mesmerizing and compelling. And I think he might even have been taken by surprise at the sort of scale of the impact his work had. He's an extraordinarily thoughtful, even modest man for somebody who is so incredibly talented. What I like about these initiatives is that they let both of our institutions be better than we were alone. It's not that we couldn't have done a Michael Armitage show if we woke up one morning and had thought about it, but the ability to do that in partnership with another institution makes it more interesting, as will all the subsequent projects over the next 3 or 4 years as Studio Museum remains under construction that will unfold at the museum. That is, what interests me is not only the capacity and ability to present works of art by artists that might have not immediately been in our field of vision, but much more importantly, it's to work with colleagues from another institution that enable us to learn with them and through them about art making. And that kind of knowledge resides on a much longer basis within the institution once you've achieved that. And I hope it works in a similar way for the Studio Museum.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Certainly. And I do think there is a model in this, right? We have found ways to continue to think about institutional autonomy, having our separate voices, of understanding the ways in which we work together, and understanding how in that working together we can create a new model of working that can last perhaps beyond even the sort of circumstance of this moment while we don't have a building. And that's what's also been amazing about being able to build this together.
Yeah.
So before we talk, go ahead, Joachim, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Well, no, Helen, not at all. I'm curious whether both of you want to, I would like to change a little bit. I mean, this is absolutely fascinating to hear you both discuss this remarkable. I'm almost tempted to ask, is it unprecedented? Maybe this model of true, indeed, collaboration, exchange between two institutions. And anyway, the results are absolutely fascinating. But I was going to change the course, if you don't mind, of our questions and bring in where I come from, which is academia. And I just wanted to share with you, as you recall, when we all started in the art world around the 80s, 90s, the academe had sort of established itself as the leading proponent of new theories, of radical new ways of thinking about art history. And the museum world seemed to be kind of lagging behind and trying to catch up with some of this. And suddenly, your two institutions are, prevalent examples, but they're not the only ones. Luckily, suddenly the machine has completely been transformed, and it's the exact opposite. We have students now coming to us saying, you know, we need to change radically our syllabi. We need to change the way we study art history in comp exams and so on and so forth. And they look to the Studio Museum, MoMA, these unbelievable programs of diversity that happened way before the BLM movement started, by the way, inevitably. And you suddenly are models for a new way of thinking about art history. I wondered whether each of you has been thinking about that, and are you in dialogue with academic institutions to augment this important conversation?
I think
Well,
no, go ahead, Thelma,
no.
please. No, please.
I was going to say, this has long been a way in which the Studio Museum has worked, because from our founding, what we were challenging is not just institutional narratives, but academic narratives.
Right.
You know, I think to the incredible role that Dr. Mirish McCampbell, an art historian herself, lead scholar on the artist Vermeer Bearden, and she built that into our formation, that we live in relationship to the Academy, creating through exhibition, but also through research, the opportunity for these new histories to be written. So it gives me great pride to look at the Studio Museum exhibition history and see the way in which those exhibitions in the 70s and the 80s impacted syllabi at universities all across this country, because of the way in which it presented the possibility of the way in which our art histories needed to change. And we continue in that work with many art historians around the country and academic departments in the city and the country as well.
You know, my sense is that the divide you were describing was never a real divide. I mean, for sure, there existed a lot of tension and even resentment between the academic and many in the museum world during the 70s, 80s, and 90s. But it was a false divide in that both the academy and the museum were deeply concerned about art and artists and trying to understand how best to talk about them, how best to tell their stories, how best to frame a social, political, cultural context in which to see and think about art. And I think what's interesting is that the current generation of curators just doesn't care about that divide. They're not worried about defending the integrity of the museum any more than they're worried about defending the integrity of the academy. What they're really interested in is the work of artists and how best to engage that. And I think the same is true in the academy, that some of the very rigid resentment or even dismissal of the kind of work that curators did has long dissolved. And now there's a much more cooperative, collaborative spirit. I mean, in addition to the program that we have with the Studio Museum, we began about 5 years ago what is now the Marin Research Consortium. It was originally the Mellon Research Consortium because Mellon Foundation gave us seed funding. But that consortium links the art history programs of 5 area universities, Princeton in the south all the way to Yale in the north, with Columbia, NYU, City College in the middle. Links those City University. It links those programs to the museum in a mutual art historical endeavor. And I think that, again, frames for me one of the things I care about most in what I do, which is to be a catalyst for engagement, to bring different groups of people who might not otherwise sit down together to recognize that it's a lot more interesting to be in a partnership. And nobody has to give anything up. It's not like anyone is diminished by it, because everyone retains their autonomous program. But the fact that you could sit down with scholars from Princeton or NYU or Yale, or brilliant curators from the Studio Museum, and talk about art just means that the conversations we can have are that much richer and more nuanced and complicated. And the end result is a very different narration to the stories we tell in the galleries. There is a very real, practical result that can be seen by anyone who walks into the museum.
Perhaps before we go on to look at some images of the renovation, the expansion that's going on through the rendering that we have of the David Atget work that's from the Studio Museum. I was wondering if both of you could talk a little bit about a museum that is a social space, because right now we don't have access to that. There was a moment, Glenn, when we all thought there might be the possibility that the MoMA and other museums in New York might be opening, but that's been delayed. But talking about this social space and how these collaborations, these relationships build on the idea of the museum as a public space that's there to serve the community and the audience in a way that is welcoming and educative at the same time.
Sure. I mean, and perhaps if we could have the image of our new building. I love seeing this image of our old building, but I know people aren't moving around the city, but if you were on 125th Street now, what you would see is this is all down. We have finished the demolition of this facade. It's now, there's a wall there. It is an exciting but very bittersweet sight that this, our 1914 building that was built as the Kenwood office building, is now demolished as we get ready to start construction. But I think that, Helen, inherent to the Studio Museum in this thinking about a building and working with the brilliant architect David Adjaye, you know, the brief that I offered in our competition and then refined as we began design was of a space that would in many ways sort of engage with three significant ideas that I think define Harlem, and they were the street, the stage, and the sanctuary. And that was to get at this idea of these different kinds of social spaces, these different ways in which social space so defined specifically the Harlem community, but also in many ways Black culture. So the building design was meant to encompass the feeling of those kinds of spaces, the street, the stage, and the sanctuary, as a way to think of the museum as not only a physical building for the presentation of art, for the engagement of audience, and for the stewardship of the life and legacy of artists, but to really be about a space that also was about engaging itself deeply in ideas of community as they existed, the sort of nostalgia that comes from the thinking of a past, but also as they would be imagined by future generations to come.
And Nick, since we have them, and I'm assuming everybody is wanting to see some images from the MoMA's Judd show, which unfortunately closed so quickly after opening, maybe we can show some of those those beautiful recontextualized gallery shots and the one or two images of the Judd installation, which I found tremendous. I was lucky enough to make it there before the museum closed. I was going to meet Richard Schiff there at one point, who was a good friend of the Rail, and I know, Joachim, you know him extraordinarily well too. And it seemed overnight that the panel discussion that he was going to be involved was canceled. But Glenn, maybe you could just talk a little bit about these beautiful galleries. There's one by curated by the artist Amy Silliman that is so compelling. And then we can maybe talk about the Judd installation after that.
Certainly. So Amy Silliman, brilliant artist in New York, was invited to do an artist choice, a program that we've had at the museum for decades, where we ask an artist to rummage through the collection and install whatever he or she wishes to, how they would like to. And so in a way, Amy's Shape of Shape, which is really about the kind of poetic relationships between objects and subjects, it is a kind of summa of what the new museum is about, the bringing together of works of art from disparate parts that all find a way to talk to each other. And obviously, the skill with which Amy did this is absolutely remarkable. And you can imagine that it would be very difficult for a curator to just say, well, let's just lean things up against the wall and create this much more casual kind of relationship. But of course, we all thrilled to the challenge that Amy posed for us of thinking about this installation as a different way of engaging objects, but also the ways in which she brought artists from very different practices and even moments in time together. And what I think you always learn from talking to and watching an artist work is this notion of the poetic or lyric way in which they see things. And so this exhibition started with a gift that Amy made of a painting to the museum, and then she started to riff on that, and she pulled the whole thing together, and it was just one of many new initiatives that marked the opening of the museum. And just take a moment to respond to this notion of the social context of the museum. And Thelma spoke so beautifully of how David's new building will amplify those foundational elements of the Studio Museum. I think the challenge that we all face in this moment of the pandemic is that we have taken such enormous pride and effort in trying to create museums that were about engagement, that found ways of bringing people together, not just with each other, but with art and with the ideas behind the institution, and this notion of the participatory space that invites people to think and talk to each other is now all, in a sense, at risk, because when we do reopen, it's all going to be about social distancing, no touch, no contact, all the dimensions of that social engagement that took so long to try and understand how to incubate and create are going to be put on hold. And then that pains me enormously because certainly the museum that Liz Diller designed for us was all about creating opportunities for that social connection, whether it was coming in from the street into a much more spacious and expansive lobby, whether it was wandering through the galleries and discovering little niches and nooks where you could sit and talk, to just how we deployed benches in the museum to encourage careful looking, but also to encourage conversations between strangers. So all of that will change now. And that's a different story.
But hopefully that'll only be temporary. And Glenn, I wanted to show this picture because in fact, that is exactly what happens. And I've witnessed this with others and with myself. Strangers will just come up to these installations and start a conversation about, well, what is that? And they'll look at the label and they go, oh, I can't believe that this is a work by, and it just engenders a whole slew of references and collective memory. And it's still interesting because it is very much by Amy Sillman, who who I appreciate her work. So you can see it through her lens as well. So one quick question, Glenn, this particular installation, is there a name for it? Like the ledges and the way that objects and sculpture and the paintings are just, as you put it, sort of casually leaning. Is there a name for this type of installation?
I don't think there's a name for it because in a way, Amy invented it as she went along. It was in a sense, I think, to give the impact of being in her studio or close to being to her studio. And so, of course, in the studio, you can lean a painting up and you don't have to worry about somebody picking it up and leaving with it. Here, there are all sorts of security issues that had to be resolved. But what Amy did, in the best sense of the word, was to challenge us. This is what you wanted, and so figure out how to make it happen. And I think everyone who was involved in the installation loved the challenge of trying to help Amy realize an installation, as you said, that invites conversation. It invites total strangers to start talking to each other about the art. And from my perspective, you can't ask much more from a museum than it can stimulate that kind of thinking.
Let's move on very quickly to one or two images of the Judd show, just to remind everybody what's waiting for us when museums are finally allowed to open again in New York. Any ideas, Glenn, on when that might be for us?
Well, we hope as soon as possible. Obviously, the governor and the mayor are concerned about rising infection rates elsewhere in the country, and they're doing their best to make sure New York City and New York State stay safe. So we're totally empathetic to their efforts to create a safe environment. We're ready to open. We've got all the PPE that we need, safety protocols, training, markers for social distancing. So as soon as the governor is convinced we can open to the public, we will. That said, one of the things we did back in March when we had to close is we went to all our lenders to the Judd show and asked if they would extend their loans to the end of this calendar year. So with any luck, even though the show opened and closed almost in the moment in which COVID hit, with any luck, there'll be plenty of time to come and see the show once we reopen.
And I just thought it was, I know so many of us have waited so long for the show, and I kept hearing about postponements, and finally I thought it was a brilliant idea to open up the expansion and to reopen with this amazing, glorious show that you really can't get a sense of from images. You need to sort of be standing there next to them and talking about this, experiencing the space and the materiality.
It's a show that was probably a decade in the making, curated by Anne Temkin, I thought with an extraordinary deftness and full of surprises. I thought I knew Judd's work really well and certainly have spent a lot of time looking at it, thrilled that we were able to acquire the monumental stack that you see there probably 15 years ago. But what I think this exhibition revealed is a Judd that many of us either didn't know or had forgotten existed, that he was a colorist from the get-go, from his earliest work right up to his latest work, that there's a joyfulness to his work and an expansiveness to his work that takes it far beyond the strict confines of minimalism that it might have otherwise been associated with, and that he was exponentially more complex in the way in which he dealt with space, shape, and color. And of course, you realize very quickly when you go through the exhibition that he's a real form maker. If you go back one image, Nick, I don't know if that's possible, that one. I mean, you just see the variety that he can get out of simple materials, plywood or plastic or metal, and yet the calibration of that and the juxtaposition of unlike substances, translucent plastic and metal, for instance, suddenly create a kind of luminous dimension that make me often think about the fact that he's almost latter-day Matisse in his approach to color. Anyway,
and yet the one you have behind you is not is like a shadow. It has no color. But in any case,
the one I have behind me is a progression, and it's there for a reason, because it is a work of art that I come into the office and I'm lucky enough to look at every day, and it makes me think. And the reason it's there is it makes me think. I have to look at it and think about the way in which that progression evolves, and its tautness is something that really impacts me personally.
And can I just add a note which I find interesting? Judd is among the sort of MoMA DNA, almost an artist. I mean, he was there in the 60s, and it's really one of the great artists of that modernist moment. What I find interesting is that one has today such a beautiful show as Glenn has showed, and that is so deep and so rich, and that is coinciding with the kind of diversity, the kind of explosion of pluridisciplinary, pluridirectional ventures that the museum is putting out at every level, at every hook and corner of the institution. And I don't know whether you want to comment on that, but for my sake, I would say that there's absolutely no contradiction whatsoever in looking with euphoria at a Judd box and going and looking at, you said, at some subcontinental Indian contemporary art. No contradiction whatsoever.
Not at all. And you know, I'm thrilled that, you know, Betty Saar and Donald Judd coincided. Artists who approach their work from totally different perspectives, and that, you know, perhaps we had to think hard about how to return to being a space where these different ways of art making and thinking about art could coexist.
Yeah.
And after all, that's the pleasure of the moment, that it isn't all resolved, that artists have many different ways of making art. And I think when institutions become too narrow in their interests, what they're really doing is filtering out everything else that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, to your point, I think it's only a contradiction when we don't understand these artists and these ways of art making as being equal. That's when we continue to be in a place where we're continuing to see what can be the predominance of certain voices, predominance of certain ways of working, so that the sort of co-equalness of thinking about our institutional programs now with a variety of voices and allowing for a variety of art histories as a way to both validate, encourage, engage, instigate new ideas, new thinking, new thought is deeply important to the museum world we're in now, and the one that I think we have to continue to be in to see the shifts that I think for many of us are necessary.
I love, Thelma, thank you for saying that. I love I'm going to retain and quote you about this segment, a variety of art histories. And thinking about you, I mean, I last saw Glenn Lowry, well, in 2 iterations at your museum. And then the next time was at the Orsay Museum, the Musée d'Orsay, the museum dedicated to mostly 19th century European art. And there was Glenn Lowry. And Glenn Lowry was invited. I don't know if you saw the show, Thelma, or in fact, indeed, whether you had something to do with it, but this was another fascinating example of an artist who was a contemporary living Black artist engaging with the entirety of the collection of this museum that has not had so much historical interaction with contemporary art in the past. And the result was breathtaking, I thought.
Right.
So I noticed, unfortunately, I'm going to have to slowly come to the end of this part of our discussion because I'm sure there'll be lots of questions to follow. But just to close, I wanted to just reiterate and just really reinforce the idea of how positive and joyous it is to see this type of relationship that's blossomed into this really fruitful, fruitful in so many ways, exhibitions and artists' works that have been shown in various voices that have been shown in various formats. But at the same time, I wanted to, because it's so positive and there is such a great message behind this, I wanted to ask the both of you, to what extent does this period, do you think, play a pivotal role perhaps in both of your illustrious careers? In other words, do you think these types of moments in collaboration and relationships will be an important part of the legacy that you leave at some point when 2016, the demographics of the United States may possibly change in a different direction?
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that question, Helen. I guess I fear that thinking about legacy while you're doing the work, then perhaps will make certain decisions about the work not be valid to the need or the moment or to real service. So I don't know if I can answer that to say if I think that this moment will be part of my legacy. What I would like to say is that I think that this moment will be one that defines the future of the Studio Museum, right? Our ability to have been started, yes, with a great collaboration of people, but without very much in terms of financial resources. But what we did have then and what we continue to have is a huge amount of cultural capital. We were rich then, and we continue to be now, as we think about this great legacy. This image is of our traveling exhibition of our collection that's traveling around the country through the amazing auspices of AFA, led by Pauline Willis. And so now it just left the Smith College Museum of Art, my alma mater, on its way to Utah. It will go to Seattle. And this exhibition really is a way to understand that the Studio Museum's legacy is about the collective voices of the past directors, curators, educators, staff people, volunteers, board members, donors, all who have been an important part of who we are and stand in solidarity with the artists who have been such at the core of what the Studio Museums has been. So I feel part of that legacy, part of that collective, part of what got us to this moment and part of what will lead us, into the next as we look towards the opening of our new building in a few years.
And how about you? What are your thoughts about how you might be moving the great, I've seen comparisons to the MoMA, in your words, to an ocean liner and also to a book where the chapters can be expanded or changed. So in either case, is this a moment that you might be considering? After all, the MoMA is a progressive institution where the future is now. Might this be a moment in which you might take stock and think about making some sort of alterations or catalysts to move things quicker or faster in the direction you're already in?
I think it's a moment to stop and take stock. I mean, I think all of us have to look hard, long, and carefully at our histories as well as our aspirations, and to recognize that we all need to change, and some of us need to change much more than we already have. And I think it's not a question of legacy, because I share Thelma's concern that if you start thinking about legacy in the moment, you make very bad decisions. You're much better off living in the moment, committing yourself to the present, and then worrying about whether or not it was meaningful later when you can look backwards and take stock. So, you know, this is a moment where, and I've said this in other situations, you have a chance, if you're an institution like ours, you have the opportunity to lean into the issue or lean away from it. And I hope that we as an institution will individually and collectively, that is each of us as individuals at the institution, but collectively as a whole, will lean into the moment and not let the issues go away. Recognize that, you know, we have done reasonably well in some areas and very poorly in others, and be honest with ourselves about what we have to do, and I would actually say what we must do to ensure that we are a better institution going forward.
Thank you. Joachim, are we ready, do you think, to move on to questions?
Absolutely, Helen. I'm really blown away, and I'm receiving, as you are, I'm sure, lots of text, and people are just so taken by each and both of you. This is a remarkable presentation, not about two institutions, but about three moments, if I may say so. Yes, the Studio Museum, yes, the MoMA, but then this new situation where exchanges, conversations, a word that I've heard many times in Glenn's mouth, are happening and are enriching what we're all doing here. And this
Yeah,
is really
definitely. It's a celebration, and I hope that something that we'll all be able to experience together in the future, sometime very soon. Nick, are you going to help us with some questions?
Absolutely. I also would love, thank you, Thelma and Glenn, for such a generous conversation. I have many questions. I want to thank everyone for sending them all in. Unfortunately, I won't be able to get to all of them, but the first person I would like to pass the mic off to ask a question is Sheila Pepe, our friend who was with us just the other week. Sheila, I think your microphone is activated.
I'm now unmuted. Thank you.
There you are. Okay. Wonderful.
Excuse me, I actually even wrote this down. I'm very aware that, and we're kind of blessed by the serendipity of the building project happening at this time, and history happening in concert with the building project. So I have two questions, one hopefully not for Thelma, although she's probably might be able to answer it, and one for Thelma specifically. The first one is, and I'm sorry if this is remedial, but it's my way of understanding these structures that I'm constantly skeptical of. Can someone explain the difference between a kind of Jim Crow, separate but equal, and then the kind of institutions that are Black founded and Black run for a period of time? Because they look similar, but I do not think it is similar. There's some kind of relationship in there, I think, that might need to be explained. Yeah. And then my second question is, can Thelma talk a bit about the evolution of Black wealth and its importance, or as it pertains to the future of a much more dynamic American cultural landscape?
Yeah, thank you, Sheila. Two very good questions that I don't know if I'm going to be able to answer adequately in such a short time. Yeah. So I think your first question, it's sort of at the heart of an understanding of cultural specificity, that the sort of legal strictures of Jim Crow, right, the separate but equal, certainly exist in a way that we don't want to understand that as the answer. And certainly there are institutional structures in education, et cetera. You know, I mean, that's where the concept is most often spoken about as it related to the very landmark Brown versus the Board of Education Supreme Court case. But I think perhaps, Sheila, more specific to our conversation with this, the idea of the choice and the mandate of cultural specificity being about an idea of cultural autonomy, right? And the idea that it isn't either or, though many, particularly in the 80s in the multicultural moment, that is often how it was positioned, right? It was about, you know, when we used to talk about the margin and the center versus different centers. right? And the way in which those different centers can exist with autonomy, but also with authority. So I think that now, in talking about cultural specificity, it is a very valid way to think about the cultural landscape. The idea that we can have institutions that are broad and institutions that are deep, institutions that are specific in what they focus on and those that are wide. And that if all of us are operating, right, with rigor and with the values of equity, then we have a rich cultural landscape. To your question about Black wealth, you know, one of what this moment is bringing out are these issues in economic equity. And so what we know about is that the strictures of supremacy have created a way that we have often a lack of Black wealth in certain ways that come from the lack of access to things like home ownership, et cetera, and the kind of intergenerational wealth that allows for. Now that has changed in ways that have been to the great benefit of many, for example, of our Black institutions, where there is a great and generous and wonderful support by African Americans, but that still is growing and needs to grow. And in its growth, to your point, I think what you might be getting at is then the representation of those people in the larger fabric. And we see some of that now, and it's changed institutions, but our hope when we begin again to talk about change is more of that, right? So that there can be a way that those voices philanthropically and politically can be not only at the table, but really leading the conversations in our cultural world.
Well, thank you, Thelma, so much for that wonderful response. I know that we have, Thelma, that you have to another
Actually,
appointment.
I'm okay, Nick.
You're okay?
We're working it out. Yeah, I'm okay.
Great. Awesome. Some magic has happened behind the scenes.
Yeah.
Amazing. So the next question that I would like to go to is from Jonas. Jonas, I would like to pass the mic over to you. And just a moment while we get you on. Jonas, can you hear us?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, welcome.
Sure. Here, I don't know if you guys can see me, but let me just pull up my question here. So this is sort of an open-ended question to both Glenn and Thelma, and I'll also just clarify, I'm a graduate student at Hunter College. So what specific work will MoMA and the Studio Museum as leading institutions in the field be doing going forward to address the extraordinarily precarious job market in the museum field as a result of COVID-19? And then how do you both, as museum directors, reckon with the fact that current trends point towards a contracting market which could drive away large numbers of talented graduates who are not financially secure enough to weather the impending economic crisis?
Thank you.
If that makes any sense.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Jonas, for that. I mean, you know, this is sort of at the forefront of my thinking, you know, when we think about what's going on in the field right now, that it not only, as you say, impacts those thinking of entering the field who don't have the economic resources to weather this, but also the impact that it's having on diverse members of our field, particularly at the entry level, for whom this moment might make it not possible for them to continue in our field. And I think that as we think about this moment being, I think for an institution like the Studio Museum at our scale and size, it was a moment to kind of acknowledge what were already those sort of fragilities involved in being a small institution with a smaller budget, and understanding the needs to rethink our institutional models to be able to not only adequately engage in a conversation that continues to be about equity in the field, bringing people into it, providing them with that opportunity, but modeling that in ways that I think some of the change that's being asked for in the field is really necessary to provide a future to another generation of professionals. And I feel that deeply when I consider my own trajectory in this field myself over these 30 years.
You know, of course, I echo what Thelma is saying, but realistically, this is a horrible moment. the wrecking of institutions that has occurred and will continue to occur over the next 24 or 36 months is going to be absolutely brutal. So at the same time that it is essential to think about new models, to recognize the need to ensure that an ever more diverse cohort of individuals populates our institutions at a professional level, will come the reality that almost every one of the institutions you could imagine, from East Coast to West, North to South, is going to contract dramatically in this period. And it's going to take years to recover. So it is a really complicated, difficult, and I think at the moment, dark problem. That by dark, I mean there are clouds that cover the landscape, and every one of those clouds carries with it, a terrible storm. This is, I am a generally optimistic person, but I am deeply pessimistic about the moment we are in terms of just seeing the American landscape of museums get through this.
Well, thank you, Glenn, for that honesty. And thank you, Jonas, for that question. It's an important perspective to keep in mind. The next question I would like to go to, just a moment, to Tabitha. Tabitha, I am, just a moment, I'm going to activate your microphone. Can you hear us, Tabitha?
Yes.
Welcome.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I guess my question is for both of you. I'd like to hear more about the specific efforts to expand the diversity in all senses of the staffs as well as the collections of the museums. I understand Glenn's point about the job market contracting, but from an artist perspective, I live in San Francisco, and the DeYoung director used to be the Met director, and the SF MoMA photo curator just came over to MoMA, and it just seems like a big switcheroo of a lot of white men. And I just feel like I'd love to know if the historically Black colleges are sought out for possible, curator positions, if you're doing anything to reach out to the indigenous community, if they even welcome that. And I just feel like the art history, and when I go to a museum, I'm seeing an exploration of the history of power. And it's just so much more interesting when you walk into that Amy Stillman room, and it's just this wide array of different levels of artists, emerging, established, dead, alive. It's just much more democratic. And Glenn, you're right. When I was in there, the entire room was chattering. Every stranger was talking to one another, not knowing who the particular artist was and how they related and the placement. It was just a buzz, buzz, buzz.
So I think we all, at a very granular level, have to fight against the contraction that's occurring, right? This is happening across the economy. So this is not a museum-centric problem. It's only that museums are, like theaters, particularly vulnerable and fragile because we are, what we do is serve the public. And if our public can't come to us, it only has a further impact on both our sense of mission, which can be accomplished in part through the digital world, but is only a fraction of the totality of experiences we can offer on site. So we're in this moment where essentially we're out of business except for that which we do in the digital world. Having said that, I'm not going to give up. We're not going to do anything other than continue to try to build a diverse staff at every level that reflects our country, and particularly our city, which New York is more diverse than the nation as a whole. So, you know, that's the commitment. It's not going to happen anywhere nearly as fast as I would like it to, but that doesn't mean that you can't continue to work at it. You know, one of the things that I've become acutely aware of is that the program that Thelma and I started for the Studio Museum Fellows was, in its simplest terms, a way of trying to expand the pipeline of talented people who saw our world as a future for themselves, right? To give them the tools to succeed. But then, you know, you start to realize, of course, we have to also then make sure they have jobs. It's not enough just to give them the tools. We also have to go the next step and say, okay, let's make sure we are creating jobs for those extraordinarily talented people so that they stay in the field if they want to stay. And, you know, we're going to have to do that. I don't have the answer to that. I'm acutely aware of the problem. I think it's magnified by the moment. And unfortunately, this is not a moment that's going to end in 6 months. It's going to be, you know, even if there were a vaccine on January 1st, the damage to the economy is going to take years to be repaired. And so I look at this and try, and I think of Jonas's question and think, okay, I have to be honest with myself and with our institution about how limited our capacity is in the short term, but not to give up and force ourselves to continue to do everything we can to expand our workforce by making good hires and creating possibilities for young people, especially people of color, to come into the field.
Yeah, and Tabitha, thank you for that. I love your switcheroo of white men, because it's like a movie I've been watching for, you know, a quarter century. And so I think that really, to just follow on what Glenn said, the real issue also that when we're talking about this is the pipeline, yes. It's really a question of opportunity. That's really what we have to be offering, right? The talent is there, the intellect's there, the people are there. It's the question of offering opportunity and understanding those barriers to opportunity. But it's also a question of support and retention, because we won't have more museum directors of color until we are able to, across the field, have a group of people who are able and have taken the trajectory towards that kind of leadership role. And so that's where, you know, the work really is. It is in, you know, really opening the opportunity, but then also creating the possibility for people to adequately move through this field in ways that give them the chance at real leadership. And that's where I think we're going to see, when we'll see real change in not just the typical switching of, you know, people for these different positions, particularly these different positions of power.
Thank you both, Thelma and Glenn, for your wonderful responses to some difficult questions. But these are important things, and we look to a more hopeful future. I would, before we go to our tradition of having a poem read to end our conversation, I just want to offer Helen or Joachim, do you have any final statements, or is there anything else you wanted to mention before we go towards the end of the conversation?
I would like to echo what you just said, Nick, and thank you both so wholeheartedly. Thelma, Glenn, yes, some of the questions have been difficult, and you've responded to them, I thought, in a powerful, enlightened, very inspiring way, as far as I'm concerned. The situation we're in is very difficult, and what I salute you both in what each one of you have said is that you've been so candid, forthright, honest about the reality and about the present and the future. As Glenn mentioned, I unfortunately, Glenn, share your slightly dark and pessimistic view. I don't think it's going to go away, even with a vaccination in hand. So we have to do. With that, I would say that we cannot possibly let our hands down and just give up. We have to start striving harder and harder in order to reach the goals that Thelma was highlighting just 5 seconds ago. So thank you both enormously for being here with us.
Thank you. And can I just thank all the people who have joined us and those in the chat, and give a special sort of virtual hug and kiss to Aggie, who is out there with us as well. But I also think that what I want to say to everyone, and that's why I've been so thrilled to see what's going on in the chat, is that these conversations about institutions are not just what happened between museum directors. They really are the conversations that we have with all of you, artists, curators, critics, supporters, members of our community. You know, for me, we cannot be in this conversation if it is not deeply communal, and if it is not deeply sort of representing what is not a singular vision of what's to come, but one that is collectively co-created together.
I echo that entirely. I really enjoy these conversations. I like learning with everyone. It's always fun to be in discussion with Joachim and Helen and Thelma anyway, but the questions were great. And, you know, as a field, we're only going to progress by being willing to talk to each other in an open and honest way, and to listen carefully and then act. And Aggie is a beacon in that respect.
Yes. Well, welcome, Aggie. I did not know that you were with us. I'm so happy you're with us at this point. Thank you.
So yes, the conversations are very important. I hope that we can continue them for as long as we need to here at the Rail. So thank you everyone for being here. And yes, I totally agree. It's all about the work, and I can't think of two more inspiring people to follow or look to than Thelma and Glenn. So thank you both so much for your generosity, not only in time, but your openness with all of us.
Yes, and I will continue the thanks, and just thank you both for the work that you do for some of the most beloved institutions to us New Yorkers. So thank you again. And I would also, again, thank you everyone for your wonderful questions. I apologize we weren't able to get to all of them. Thank you, Aretsu and Mandy and many others. But as our tradition here at the Rail, we end all of our lunchtime conversations with a poem. And today we are honored and thrilled to be, to welcome none other than Anne Waldman, a great friend of the Rail and to poets and artists alike. I will very briefly read an introduction for Anne and pass the mic off to her. So Anne Waldman is an internationally recognized and acclaimed poet who's been an active member of the Outrider experimental poetry community, a culture she has helped create and nurture for over 4 decades as a writer, editor, teacher, performer, magpie scholar, infrastructure curator, and cultural political activist. There are countless books and countless things that Anne has done, but I will let her speak for herself, and I will pass the mic off to you, Anne, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much, and that was a very generative conversation, and very welcome with the museums being closed and so on. So thank you both, Thelma and Glenn Lowry. Very special, and the questions I thought were so pertinent and on a lot of people's minds. But I'm going to do a couple of things. This is a poem by Adrian Piper, the great artist, and it's from her Decide Who You Are texts, and this is from 1991, and it's part 11. Remains. Lately, I've been trying something new, to live without illusions and cherish what remains. A real challenge, those remains. They countenance no soporific Twitter. Draw near to inspect them, and they singe your lashes. No more blinking, no more eyebrows to raise in surprise either. A perfect tan is now yours in those hard to reach places. Secret places now burning through with the rest of me, raining down, up in flames, crumbling into exhausted powder, calories sacrificed to the cause of consumption and creation. Your perfect tan, now somewhat leathery, now ashes and charcoal. Your inner lining, the next to go, flames making inroads into my interior, scorching off layers of skin, melting scar tissue that can't grow fast enough to heal the burns. Nothing left now but naked innards, fragile bones, transparent vessels, waiting for whatever remains. After the illusions are torched, the myths deflated, for what soothes the pain of sight uninsulated by faith, for what breaks the flight of attention, what blocks the escape into fantasy, what restores the focus of consciousness. The sacred remains, the assault of the real, the dissection of fact, the mystery of unmeaning, the dwindling of self, the release into motion. And this is from a recent book, thank you.
Amazing.
This is Donald Judd's Amigdala, and it's, I'll just read a little bit. It's a longer poem and sort of finished, I think, at Marfa, but started out in New York. The color in situ, it color parallels in situ. I wanted all the colors to be present at once. In place, it resolves, it solves, it resolves, devolves, absolves. Fear in place. It says, I am placed thus, in pure, unconditioned, but adjudicated space with tug of form. In space, it says, start with a dot in space, a formation of boxes in situ, in sight rendered by chance, by accountability, prefabrication, cool interior of distant waters, hues of quiescence, by dim light of receptacles of color in place in situ, hold, contain, beat, and enameled into certain hues. Pare it down, pare it down, pare it down. Australian Aborigines take 40 years to become songmen, memorizing epic material that covers a cycle of migration. It might take 20, 40 years, and your poem will tell of this, as well as the total botany of an area and where the water holes hide. Tradition that could be 14,000 years old. Time has many anthropomorphic representations, such as Father Time, but space has none. What Holocaust could rock this powerhouse of emptiness? And then very quickly, for a dear friend who died of COVID, and it's called Existential, and it's for Hal Wilner, wonderful music producer who, you know, many albums by Lou Reed and Marianne Faithfull and Laurie Anderson, and then worked with poets such as Allen Ginsberg, William Burroughs, and Amity Baraka. When he died, was working on an album of John Wiener's poetry and with various musicians. So Existential. You will be in danger. Who will take care of you? If not, think big. Who will arrive? Who can cross the threshold? Others in danger, and institutions in danger, and what we love to listen to, look at in tentacular dimensions. Love is a thief, survival is a thief, and steals you away. But that is small danger and conceited, and forever wash the stain like Lady Macbeth from her hands. Who says it is a crazed man in charge, or that is your danger, genocidal? You know the score, the deal. Language is not its own reality, but a tool. Out, damned spot. Diaphanous resemblance to floating ideas you remember is dangerous. Opportunism, as if to remind you, hold on, mind, as if to remind you it's not just the forms of megacities, strife of work and pandemic angst and uprising to kill supremacy. Back to the streets again, and ineptitude, leisure that adheres. It's total colonialization. It is an endless imaginary. Crowds in fashion and out of money and begging to take shelter below. We are on the subterranean dance floor in the empty museum. A shot rings out in the mind, in the Zoom, in the virtual movie. You aren't even there. It's the girl in the spotted dress. Danger breaks open. What if you are not alone in your noir? You are not alone in the effort. Gun sales rise and you can kill your enemy, or simply say you are just breathing, exposing failure of human, not alone in the garden, in the arena, the snake pit, the cerulean of an eye, dark face, my lover, my Robot, my poetry, stay inside, not alone in the struggle between interstices of pro and con or protocol. Protect us, not alone in the logarithms of races and the ideogrammatic oligarchy. Think with your teeth, your brain, not alone, a secret between initiates, just us at the top of the chain. Not alone, task of lifetimes, bite hand that doesn't feed you anymore. Delivery demand overwhelmed at dawn. The explanation in uncertain shades of blue. Outcome in a lung, a color wheel of medical cryogenics. Is that what she called it? Am I going mad? Fades in and out. I can barely read and collapse, eaten by the simulacra worm of death. Hal wrote, he wrote to me a last note of horror of corona, the excruciating headaches, the blank wall, and the mind amused. Where are my people? My real breathing. I can hear them breathing people.
Thank you so much, Anne. I can't wait till, we can meet in spaces in person again so that I can hear and experience the thunderous applause that follows your readings. So thank you so much for that and for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank
Great.
you. Thank you.
I want to extend mine and the Rails thanks to Thelma, to Glenn, to Helen, Joachim. Thank you for such a candid, generous conversation today. I want to let everyone know that we do this every day at 1 p.m. And I'm so glad that we had Anne reading for us, because our event tomorrow is actually a tribute to John Ashbery on his birthday. It is organized by Marcella Durand, and we will be joined by poets such as Anselm Berrigan, our very own poetry section editor, also Ted Colby, Tanya M. Foster, Emily Skillings. So please, if you're available, help us or join us in celebrating John Ashbery's birthday tomorrow. Thank you all, as always, for joining us. Again, thank you, Thelma and Glenn, for being with us today. You're probably two of the busiest people in New York, so it means a lot to have you here in conversation with us today. And I would like to invite everyone to unmute themselves now to say farewell or hello or whatever else is on your mind. And hope you all have a great start to your week, and stay well and safe, everyone.
Thank you. Stay well, everyone. Be safe.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Thelma.
Thank you, everyone.
Joachim and Helen.
Thank you,
Thank
thank
you,
you,
Anne.
thank
Thank
you.
you so much for that reading, Anne.
Waldman is a goddess. You're the best. I'm a fan.
And Waldman is a goddess, yes.
Thank you.
Incredible.
Thank you, Sheila, for your
Great.
question.
Thank you. See you guys later.
All right. Bye.
Good to see you as ever, Candida.
Hey,
Good to see you.
good to see you, Candida.
Hi, hi, Thelma. Hi, Joachim.
Background.
Texting you, Thelma.
Thank you, Glenn.
Mom.
Hey, Tam.
Thanks always, Thelma.